The desert tells the truth before men do. On the morning of November 25th, 1177, the wind moved across the coastal plain of the Levant like it was carrying news. Dust rose in thin, nervous sheets and then fell again, as if the land itself couldn't decide whether to stay quiet or to warn everyone. Somewhere beyond low ridges and scattered scrub, an army was already spilling outward across the countryside. Tents, banners, pack animals, men drifting into foraging parties with the easy confidence of people who believe the day is already theirs. And then, against every rule a commander learns by surviving long enough, another force appeared. Not an army in the way you imagine one, not a proud wall of steel, more like a compact knot of movement. A few hundred knights, a thin line of foot soldiers, and at their center, a teenage king whose own body was failing him. Baldwin IV of Jerusalem was 16. He was already marked by leprosy, not the theatrical curse of later legend, not a silver mask in cinematic mystery, but a real disease that quietly steals sensation and strength, one nerve at a time. He wasn't yet the helpless figure history would eventually describe, but he was sick enough that everyone around him knew the truth. Time was not on his side. By any sensible measure, he had no business being there. And yet he was, because the world around him had begun to close like a fist. Across the south and east stood a power that had a name people whispered before they spoke of battles: Saladin, Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub. 40 years old, disciplined, practical, devout, but not naive. Not the kind of leader who needed cruelty to make men obey. He had something more durable: structure, reputation, and the patience to build an empire one careful decision at a time. Saladin had bound Egypt and Syria into a single rising force, and that unity mattered more than any single victory. For the Crusader kingdom, small, fractured, always arguing with itself, it meant the ground under their feet was shifting. Most invasions begin with calculations: water, grain, distance, routes, morale. But Saladin's campaign carried something sharper than logistics. It carried confidence. He expected the Kingdom of Jerusalem to do what weaker states often do when a larger power arrives: retreat behind walls, bargain in fear, fracture under pressure. He expected to raid the land hard enough that the Crusaders would fall apart politically before they ever fell militarily. And he did not expect the sick boy king to come out and meet him. That's the hinge of this story. Not the numbers, not the romance, not the legend of impossible odds. The hinge is a decision made by someone who understood that waiting would be a slow kind of death. Modern people love to say, "Don't do desperate things." Baldwin didn't have that luxury. Desperation wasn't a phase for him. It was the baseline. Picture the Crusader host up close, not as heroic silhouettes, but as tired men and strained horses. Their mounts are not fresh. Their infantry are not professional soldiers in the modern sense. Many are local levies, men with families in villages that would become ash if this campaign succeeded. Alongside them, clergy carry a relic the kingdom believed was part of the true cross. In the medieval world, that wasn't a decorative symbol. It was morale made physical. It was a claim, quiet, unbreakable, that God was watching. Ahead, beyond the rise, Saladin's forces are spread across the landscape. They've been moving hard too, but discipline has loosened because the situation seems safe. Their commander expects the enemy to behave like a cornered state: cautious, defensive, predictable. And that is what makes this moment dangerous. Because expectations are weapons. If you can predict your enemy, you've already narrowed their options. You've already fenced them in, even if you never build a wall. Baldwin's advantage was not strength. It wasn't numbers. It wasn't better equipment. It was that Saladin believed Baldwin could not afford risk, so Baldwin chose risk. Not recklessly, strategically. There is a rule that runs through every century of warfare. A smaller force can strike a larger force if the larger force is not concentrated. If the larger force is dispersed, spread out for food, water, speed, and convenience, its size becomes a weakness for a few precious minutes. Orders take time. Units are separated by distance. Confusion spreads faster than command. And Baldwin was searching for exactly that window. He rides along his front rank, not as a mythic statue, not as a child playing at kingship. He rides like someone who understands that his body is secondary to timing. He looks at the banners. He looks at the relic. He looks at the men who chose to follow him when they could have chosen safety. And he makes the world small for them. Not, "We must defeat all of them," but "We must break them here." Good leaders do that. When chaos is coming, they don't promise comfort.
they give clarity. Some later chroniclers would call what happens next a miracle. Some Muslim writers would call it a warning. A modern analyst might call it a failure of operational security, an army overextended, relaxed, and exposed at the exact wrong moment. All of those are different languages describing the same truth. A vast force, briefly vulnerable. A small force, briefly united. A narrow window that will not open twice. And Baldwin, this is what makes him extraordinary, was willing to stake the entire kingdom on one afternoon. He understood the alternative. If Jerusalem stayed behind walls while Saladin burned the countryside, the city might survive the day but lose the year. You can't defend a kingdom by defending only its stones. If fields are destroyed and people flee, the walls become a prison, not a refuge. So Baldwin aimed to break the campaign's momentum, not by outlasting it, but by striking its confidence. He did not need to destroy Saladin's army completely. He needed to make it doubt. Because morale is not a side effect of battle. Morale is a battlefield. When soldiers begin to believe the pattern of the world has broken, when they start to wonder what the enemy knows that they don't, order collapses from the inside. That is the weapon Baldwin is raising, long before any lance is lowered. The dust thickens, the sun climbs. Somewhere out there, Saladin's men are still scattered, still tasting victory in their minds. They believe the Crusaders will do what they always do and outmatched, retreat, bargain, delay. And then they see it. A line on a ridge, a cross banner in the wind, another banner beside it, a compact force moving with purpose. At first it doesn't make sense. A patrol perhaps, a small raid, a handful of knights brave enough to show themselves and then vanish. But the dust keeps coming, the line keeps advancing. And the strangest part is not that the Crusaders are there, it's that they are not hesitating. They are not testing the distance, they are not waiting for perfect ground, they are not acting like men who expect to lose, they are committing. That commitment is the first blow because it tells everyone watching, they are not afraid of you. Fear is not decided by arithmetic alone, fear is decided by whether you believe the world still makes sense. A small force charging a larger one can feel like madness, and madness is contagious. It makes disciplined soldiers ask a dangerous question. What do they know that we don't? For Saladin, this is the moment a campaign shifts from routine to crisis. He begins issuing orders to concentrate. Messengers ride, units try to assemble. But distance is stubborn, and time is cruel. The larger the army, the longer it takes to become a single instrument again. And Baldwin is counting on that delay. He knows his strength is not in endurance, it is in tempo. He looks once more at the ridge ahead, at the dust, at the movement on the plain. He steadies his horse, he steadies his breathing, he steadies his men. And in that thin space between silence and thunder, between hesitation and commitment, Baldwin makes the choice that turns history. Because if he waits, Jerusalem becomes a story of walls and surrender. If he strikes now, the kingdom gets something priceless. Time.
If you want to understand Montgisard, you have to stop thinking of it as a small army versus a big army, and start thinking of it as two men living by two different clocks. Saladin's clock was imperial. He could afford time. If a raid failed, he could return next season. He had depth, cities, revenue, manpower, and a growing administrative machine that could raise another force, pay it, feed it, and move it again. His war wasn't one roll of the dice. It was a long campaign of pressure, bargaining, and momentum. Baldwin's clock was personal. It was ticking inside his body. Baldwin IV became king of Jerusalem at 13, and unlike the legends that later wrapped him in theatrical mystery, the sources point to something more chilling because it's so ordinary. His illness was noticed the way a modern diagnosis might begin, through a small inconsistency. A tutor observed that the boy didn't react to pain like other children. That detail matters, because leprosy, what we'd call Hansen's disease today, often damages nerves. It can take away sensation long before it takes away strength. It doesn't make you invincible. It makes you vulnerable in a different way. You don't feel injuries, so injuries multiply. You don't notice damage, so damage accumulates. So Baldwin grew into power with a body he couldn't fully trust. And in modern terms, that's almost impossible to overstate. He wasn't just a sick teenager. He was a sick teenager running a frontier state that was constantly under threat, constantly short on manpower, and constantly fighting itself from the inside. Because the Kingdom of Jerusalem wasn't a unified nation in the modern sense. It was a patchwork of noble families, castle lords, military orders, and foreign interests, people who shared a religion but not always a plan. Baldwin had to manage all of that while his own future grew narrower. That's why the sources describing him as unusually sharp are so striking. They don't paint him as a passive symbol. They show a young king who listened, judged, negotiated, and, when it mattered, made decisions. And then there's Saladin. Saladin, or Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, rises in the same period as a different kind of leader, less a romantic warlord and more a builder of systems. He unifies Egypt and Syria and binds rival factions into something stable enough to keep moving. And he does it with a combination that's rare in any century: personal discipline, political patience, and a reputation for piety that wasn't just performative. But Saladin also understood something very modern. Optics are power. Victory has to look inevitable, not merely because it scares enemies, but because it holds allies together. If you're trying to unite different factions under one banner, you need momentum. You need people to believe you're the future. So by the late 1170s, both men are carrying more than swords. Baldwin has to prove the Crusader kingdom can still resist, or it fractures and dies from fear before it even loses a siege. Saladin has to prove that unity under his leadership is the new reality, or rival emirs and hesitant allies start calculating their exit. Now set the scene for the campaign. We need to be careful with medieval numbers. Chroniclers often inflate them, sometimes to glorify a victory, sometimes to excuse a defeat, sometimes simply because counting large forces precisely was difficult. So when you hear exact totals repeated with absolute certainty, a modern reader should treat them as rough scale rather than exact math. What we can say confidently is this: Saladin brought a large force, large enough to threaten the Crusader state directly, while Baldwin could only gather a comparatively small field army. The imbalance was real, even if the precise headcount is debated. And that imbalance shaped everything. Because it wasn't just about how many men you had, it was about what kind of army you could afford to maintain. Baldwin's most valuable weapon wasn't a relic or a speech. It was heavy cavalry, Frankish knights trained and equipped for shock action. In modern language, think of them as an expensive weapon system: armor, horses, training, discipline, coordination. That kind of force hits hard, but it's limited by cost. You can't simply raise more quickly. Saladin's advantage wasn't only numbers, it was depth. A deeper base of manpower, a larger treasury, and a growing ability to keep campaigns going without collapsing at home. So why would Baldwin ever meet him in the open? That's where the two clocks idea becomes the key. Saladin can afford the long game. He can raid, probe, withdraw, return. He can force the Crusaders to spend money they don't have, burn resources they can't replace, and make the political factions inside Jerusalem blame each other until unity breaks. Baldwin can't afford that timeline. His kingdom is too fragile, and his own health makes every season feel like borrowed time. So Baldwin's strategic world becomes narrower. He needs moments. He needs windows. He needs situations where the larger force cannot bring its full strength to bear at once. In modern terms, he needs the enemy to be caught in transition, moving, dispersed, reorganizing. And Saladin, in 1177, is moving with confidence. He expects the Crusader response to be defensive. He expects them to shelter behind walls and rely on fortresses. And frankly, that expectation isn't irrational. It's how weaker states often survive against stronger ones. Fortresses buy time. They force sieges. They slow campaigns. They make warfare expensive. But fortresses also come with a brutal downside. They can't chase an army. If you hide behind walls while your opponent burns the countryside, you might keep a city for a season, but you lose the surrounding land that feeds it, and sooner or later you're defending stone while the kingdom around the stone is already gone. So Saladin's plan is pressure, speed, and psychological dominance. Move fast, forage widely, avoid unnecessary sieges, make the Crusader leadership look helpless, let fear do as much work as cavalry. Baldwin's plan, still forming at this stage, still risky, begins with a different question. Not, how do I stop this army forever, but where is the one moment this army is most vulnerable? This is where modern military thinking lines up perfectly with medieval reality. The most dangerous time for any large force is when it's not fully configured for combat, when it's spread out, when units are separated by distance, when orders take time to travel, when the system that makes the army an army becomes sluggish. Saladin's discipline was usually excellent, but even excellent discipline loosens when your enemy is expected to stay behind walls. Foraging parties range farther, camps spread wider, the army becomes a moving landscape instead of a clenched fist. And Baldwin's mind, sharp, pressured, and aware of time, sees opportunity in exactly that. So part 2 of this story isn't really about the battlefields yet, it's about the collision of two strategic temperaments. Saladin, building inevitability through patience and scale. Baldwin, forced into urgency by fragility, both personal and political, choosing to hunt for a single decisive window. Two clocks, two leaders. And as they move toward each other, the tragedy and the brilliance of Montgisard becomes clear. One man has time, the other man needs time. And that means the next decision won't be about comfort, or safety, or even tradition. It will be about tempo. By the time Saladin's banners crossed into Crusader territory in the autumn of 1177, the invasion didn't look like a raid anymore. It looked like the beginning of the end. Out on the coastal plain, the land itself seemed to shrink under the weight of movement. Columns of riders, pack animals, supply bundles, and scouts fanning outward like fingers. Villages went quiet. Farmers stopped working their fields. People didn't need a messenger to tell them what was coming. In a frontier kingdom, you learned to read dust on the horizon, the way sailors read the sea. Along the roads, refugees began to move towards stone walls, towards towers, chapels, and fortresses that had protected them before. Gates closed. Watchmen stayed longer on the battlements. Even the wind felt different, as if it carried the sound of hooves long before anyone could actually hear them. This is what Saladin was counting on, not just the physical damage of his campaign, but the psychological damage. A kingdom can survive a battle. It's much harder to survive a season of fear. And while Jerusalem's nobles argued in halls and whispered in corridors, Baldwin was in the south, tied to the fortress network near Ascalon, close to the line where Egypt's power met the Crusader frontier. That detail matters because the story often gets distorted into a simple myth, the sick boy king racing out of Jerusalem at the last moment. The reality is still dramatic, but more practical. Baldwin was positioned where the threat was coming from. He could feel the pressure building. He could see how quickly the campaign could move north and turn into something the kingdom could not stop. Inside Ascalon's stone halls, dispatches arrived like hammer blows. Reports of scattered raids, foraging parties stripping the countryside, green standards appearing where no green standards had been before. Every message carried the same truth. Saladin was moving with confidence, and confidence makes an army fast. Baldwin gathered what he could. Not the whole kingdom. He didn't have time for that. Not an ideal army. He didn't have one. He gathered what was available. Household knights, troops from nearby garrisons, and the one fighting force in the kingdom that could reliably do the same thing every time under pressure: Templars. It's easy to describe the military orders as fanatics. Some were certainly extreme, but there's a more useful way to understand them. They were professionals with a religious framework. They trained together, held discipline, and responded to command structure in a way feudal levies often didn't. Baldwin needed that reliability, because what he was preparing wasn't a siege. It wasn't a long defense behind walls. It was a gamble. And to make men gamble with him, he needed more than steel. He needed morale, something tangible, something visible, something that could hold a fearful army together when the moment came to commit. That's why the relic matters. The kingdom believed it possessed a fragment of the true cross. Modern viewers can approach that with skepticism, and that's fine, but you can't understand medieval war if you treat belief as decoration. For soldiers of the time, a relic wasn't a prop. It was legitimacy made portable. It was the idea that God's attention was not only in churches, but in the dust and danger of the field. When the relic was brought out, carried carefully by clergy, surrounded by guards, it wasn't simply a religious act. It was a psychological act, a signal to the army and to the kingdom that this campaign was not being abandoned to fate. Meanwhile, Saladin did what a commander with speed and confidence often does. He avoided wasting time. He bypassed strong points when it suited him. He moved around fortresses rather than battering himself against them. From a strategic perspective, it makes perfect sense. Why spend days on stone when your enemy's heart is elsewhere? Why give the Crusaders a long siege to rally around when the countryside can be stripped in hours? So Saladin flowed past Crusader walls like water around a rock, leaving garrisons staring helplessly down at a moving landscape of tents and standards and riders. That helplessness was part of the plan. A fortress garrison can watch. It can endure. It can't chase. And chasing was exactly what Baldwin was preparing to do. The key moment comes when information shifts from rumor to clarity. Baldwin's scouts began bringing back reports that were both terrifying and electrifying. Saladin's force was large, larger than the Crusaders could meet in a fair contest. But it was also spread out. Foraging parties ranged wide. Units moved loosely across miles of countryside. The camp itself was not a single clenched fist. It was a scattered hand. To a cautious commander, that might still look like certain defeat. To Baldwin, it looked like the only kind of battlefield where a smaller force can create a shock large enough to change a campaign. Because a dispersed army, for all its size, has one weakness. It needs time to become an army again. Orders take time to travel. Units take time to assemble. Even the most disciplined cavalry cannot appear instantly on a single line. Distance is friction. Friction becomes delay. Delay becomes vulnerability. Inside Ascalon's stone halls, Baldwin's war council became less about whether to fight, and more about where the fight could actually be won. Imagine them around a table, maps and markers, candlelight, the sound of the sea wind outside. Baldwin points, not with drama, but with focus. He isn't dreaming of glory. He's searching for a point on the map where Saladin's advantages cannot fully express themselves. And then he decides, not to wait behind walls, to move. The departure from Ascalon is not the beginning of a heroic parade. It's the beginning of a forced tempo. Men and mounts pushed hard, cohesion held together by discipline and urgency. Along the coastal track, dust rises behind them. Horses sweat. Infantry grind forward with stubborn endurance. And in the center of it all, the relic moves like a steady heartbeat, an anchor for the mind. Baldwin rides near the front. He doesn't need to be there in a purely military sense. A king can command from behind. But Baldwin understands something modern leadership studies would recognize immediately. Visibility is a tool. In high-stress environments, people look for a signal that the system is still intact. A leader's presence can be that signal. And for Baldwin, young, sick, doubted, presence is also a statement. It tells his army, I am not asking you to go where I will not go. As they advance, scouts range ahead over rolling ground, low ridges, shallow folds in the land, terrain that can hide movement and distort distance.
One scout crusts a rise and finally sees what Baldwin has been hunting. Saladin's forces, visible in dispersed clusters, green standards scattered, riders moving without full battle posture. It's the kind of report that turns a desperate march into a plan. The scout returns at speed. He dismounts hard. He points toward the horizon. Commanders gather close. And Baldwin listens without theatrics, because at this moment, emotion is less useful than precision. Then Baldwin gives the order that changes everything. The Crusader force slips into dead ground, a fold in the terrain that hides them from view. This is where the story becomes quietly brilliant. From a distance, the plain may look open, but anyone who has fought on real ground knows open is often an illusion. Small ridges can hide whole formations, shallow depressions can mask movement. A few meters of elevation can turn invisibility into exposure. Baldwin uses that. The Crusaders compress into the low ground. Horses are kept steady. Men speak less. Banners are controlled. Every movement becomes smaller, cleaner, more intentional. Up on the ridge beyond, Saladin's men continue their routines. Some foraging parties still believe they have all the time in the world. That's the danger of confidence. It convinces you the enemy must behave predictably. But Baldwin's force is no longer playing by the expected script. Behind the ridge, lances begin to align. Templars tighten into disciplined shape. Infantry closes gaps. Clergy study the relic against gusting wind. And Baldwin rides forward just enough to look out once more. Through the amber haze, he sees the scattered green standards. He sees the distance. He sees the last chance. His banded hand tightens near the sword hilt, not in a dramatic flourish, just a controlled motion of someone who knows the next decision will either buy the kingdom time or end it. And then the Crusader banners rise higher over the ridgeline, catching the sun. For one heartbeat, everything holds still, like the land is waiting to see whether courage will be enough to break momentum. And on that ridge, with dust in the air and a kingdom behind him, Baldwin chooses the moment.
Before the charge, there was the march. That's the part people skip when they want the story to sound like magic. They jump straight to the cloche, straight to the shock, and they forget what it costs to even arrive at the moment where shock is possible. Baldwin's body mattered at Montgisard, but not in the theatrical way later legends insist. He wasn't a masked phantom strapped to a saddle like a corpse. That image belongs to a later imagination that wanted him to be supernatural. The truth is more human, and honestly, more impressive. He was sick. His hands were often wrapped. Sensation in his limbs was fading in patches. He could push through discomfort in ways that were dangerous, because numbness doesn't protect you. It simply hides the warning signs. He could injure himself without noticing. He could bleed without feeling the first sting of it. And yet, he was still a king who made decisions. That's what defines this phase of the story. Not his pain, but his control. Because as the campaign tightened, Baldwin wasn't just facing Saladin's army. He was racing his own limits, and he knew it. From Ascalon, the Crusader host moved fast. Not a cinematic sprint across impossible distance, but a disciplined push that strained men and horses enough to leave fatigue visible in every posture. Infantry marched with shoulders slumped under weight. Knights checked tack constantly, because a loose strap at the wrong moment could end everything. Horses foamed lightly at the bit, muscles tightening and relaxing like they were arguing with themselves. The wind carried dust and heat. The sun climbed. Water was rationed. This is what medieval campaigning really looks like. Not glorious speeches every hour, but constant management of friction, distance, thirst, sleep, and morale. And Baldwin's morale problem was sharper than most. He wasn't just asking men to fight a larger force. He was asking them to follow a teenage king who looked to many like he was already losing a war inside his own skin. The whispers were there. The doubt was there. The fear was there. So Baldwin did what great leaders do when the numbers aren't on their side. He created a center. He gave them something to orbit around. That's where the relic comes back into focus. The clergy carried what the kingdom believed was a fragment of the true cross. Again, modern viewers can believe or doubt the relic's holiness. The crucial point is that the soldiers believed it mattered. In a medieval army, faith wasn't separate from strategy. Faith was the engine that kept men moving when they were exhausted and terrified. When the relic came forward in the column, guarded and held steady against the wind, it told the army, without words, this campaign is not abandoned. God is not far away. The kingdom still has a spine. Baldwin made sure he was seen near that center, not because he needed the relic to be brave, but because he understood how people work under stress. They look for signs that the system is intact. A king is one of those signs. And as they moved across the plain, you can feel the story tightening like a bowstring. The Crusaders crossed shallow wadis and uneven ground. They halted briefly in sparse shade when they could. They checked waterskins. They tightened buckles. They remounted. They kept moving. It wasn't heroic in the glossy sense. It was heroic in the way endurance is heroic. The way refusing to fall apart is heroic. Then, as late afternoon light began to soften into gold, scouts rode out ahead over rolling ground. Low ridges and shallow folds broke up the landscape, creating pockets of invisibility. From a distance, the plain could look smooth and open.
Up close, it was full of small features that could hide an entire formation if you used them correctly. A scout crested one of those ridges and finally saw what Baldwin had been hunting. Saladin's forces were there, spread across the countryside. Tents and banners scattered. Riders dismounted and moving casually in places. Foraging parties ranged wide. It wasn't chaos, but it wasn't a concentrated battle line either. It was an army in campaign mode, not battle mode. For a moment, that report would have felt like terror. The enemy was enormous. The scale of it was unmistakable. But it was also opportunity. Because a dispersed force, even a powerful one, has a vulnerability built into its very size. It needs time to become a single instrument. It needs time to gather, align, and respond to orders. Baldwin didn't need to beat all of them at once. He needed to hit them before they could become all of them. So the scout returned at speed, dust trailing behind his horse. He pulled up hard near Baldwin's commanders. He pointed toward the ridgeline. The men gathered close, reading his urgency like a second message. And Baldwin listened. Not with panic. Not with excitement. With focus. Then he made the move that turns a desperate army into a dangerous one. He put them into dead ground. This is one of those details that looks small in a summary, but decides battles in reality. Dead ground means terrain that hides you from an enemy's view. Low folds, shallow depressions, the far side of a ridge. When you're outnumbered, invisibility becomes armor. The Crusader force slipped down into a shallow fold. Horses were studied. Banners were controlled. Voices dropped. Infantry crouched and adjusted grips. Templars tightened their line. Clergy huddled around the relic, shielding candle flames from gusts, incense mixing with dust. And Baldwin, this is important, allowed the army to breathe for a moment. Not to rest fully, to focus. A leader has to know when to push and when to compress. Baldwin understood that the march had been the push. Now came the compression, turning a tired force into a single strike. In the distance, Saladin's men continued their routines. In some parts of the camp, discipline was still relaxed. The bigger force was confident in its script. The Crusaders would defend walls, not attack in open ground. That expectation slowed reaction time even before the first order was given. And here, we can allow the story to carry a hint of myth. Not as literal magic, but as the way people experienced the day. As the sun dipped, dust in the air caught the light and glowed like embers. The relic's metal fittings flashed when the angle was just right. Soldiers later described it as a sign, a warning, a promise. Modern eyes can call it optics, the physics of sunlight and dust. But for men who believed God's will moved through history, it felt like destiny leaning in. Inside the dead ground, lances began to align. Shield straps were checked. Horses shifted weight, ears forward, muscles tight. The Templars held their banner steady, black and white snapping sharply in the wind. The Jerusalem cross banner rose beside it, as if the kingdom itself was standing up straighter. Baldwin remounted. Attendants studied him briefly, not because he couldn't ride at all, but because even small instability at this moment could be fatal. He settled into the saddle with careful control. He rode to the edge of the ridge and looked out across the plain one last time. And that's the moment where the story becomes almost unbearably quiet. Because he sees the enemies still not fully gathered. He sees the distance. He sees the last chance. He doesn't need a long speech. His men already know what's at stake. What they need now is not inspiration, it's certainty. Baldwin lowers his chin. He studies his breathing. His banded hand settles near the sword hilt with a small, deliberate motion. Behind him, the infantry tightens. The Templars adjust their angle. The clergy brace the relic. And then, slowly, Baldwin and the front ranks rise up out of the dead ground. They climb toward the ridge crest, not with chaos, but with discipline. Horses step uphill with realistic traction. Infantry follows in coherent lines. The banners rise into view, first as hints of color, then as unmistakable shapes against the burning sky. Across the plain, distant riders begin to notice. A few point, a few turn, but it's late. The enemy's reaction has to travel across distance in dust and confusion. At the ridgeline, Baldwin's formation reaches the crest and halts for a heartbeat. Not hesitation, control. Horses tense, lances poised. Wind snapping cloth. The sun is low, dust swirling around them like a veil. And for that single breath of time, the fate of the kingdom rests on one choice that cannot be taken back. Then Baldwin holds the field in his gaze, steady, silent, decisive, ready to release the storm.
Saladin's mistake at Montgisard wasn't stupidity, and it wasn't some cartoon version of pride. It was something far more common, something commanders in every era fall into when a pattern has worked for too long. He expected Baldwin to behave like a weaker ruler usually behaves. For months, the Crusader states had done what they often did when pressure rose. They relied on walls, fortresses, diplomacy, and delay. They avoided open battle when the odds looked bad. They argued among themselves. Their politics were noisy and fragile, and Baldwin, young, ill, constantly questioned, seemed like the last king who would gamble everything on one afternoon in open ground. So Saladin moved with a kind of confidence that felt rational. His army advanced into Crusader territory and spread out across the countryside, doing what large forces do when they believe they have time. Foraging widely, watering horses wherever wells and orchards allowed it, letting units stretch into the landscape. Not chaos, Saladin's discipline was usually better than that, but a relaxed posture that assumes the enemy will stay behind stone. From the outside, it looked unstoppable, green standards flickering across miles, dust columns rising in the heat, tents pitched loosely, supply bundles stacked, riders dismounting here and there to rest and eat. It wasn't an army braced for a sudden fight. It was an army living inside the expectation of victory. And expectations in war are dangerous. Because the moment your enemy stops following the script you've built in your mind, your strength can turn into friction. Your size becomes delay. Your distance becomes a problem. Your scattered posture becomes vulnerability. That's the exact posture Baldwin was hunting. Late in the day, the first warning comes in the oldest form of battlefield intelligence: dust on the horizon. At first, it's easy to dismiss. A patrol, a small raid, a minor provocation from a desperate garrison. Saladin had seen those before, and they rarely meant much when he held the initiative. But the dust doesn't stay small. It thickens. It stretches. It begins to look less like a single rider and more like a moving line. A messenger rides hard toward Saladin's position. The horse slows sharply in the guard ring, momentum pulling it forward before it settles. The rider leans in, speaking urgently. Saladin listens without theatrics, because what matters to a commander is not fear, but information. He turns his head towards the horizon, eyes narrowing slightly. Still, even now, it's not instantly obvious what he's seeing. In a world without radios, without aerial surveillance, and without instant coordination, you interpret movement through uncertainty. You ask yourself, is this a feint? A larger force hidden behind the ridge? Are the Crusaders trying to lure you into an ambush? And then the banners appear. Cross banners, distinct shapes cutting through dust and glare. Not a small scouting party, a compact, coherent formation moving with purpose. That's when the situation changes from routine to crisis. Saladin does what a serious commander does. He asserts control. He signals to concentrate. Messengers ride outward. Officers shout orders. Units begin to turn inward from their scattered positions and move toward a center point. But here is the problem that no amount of genius can fully erase. Distance is stubborn. If your force is spread across miles, you can't compress it instantly. You can't snap your fingers and turn foragers into a battle line. Every order must travel through dust and noise. Every unit must interpret it correctly. Every rider must find his place. And every minute that passes is a minute your enemy can use. Baldwin is using every minute. From the ridge, the Crusader formation begins to move, first as a steady downhill roll, then faster and faster again. Knights align, lances level, the Templars tighten their wedge, the Jerusalem cross banner rises and snaps in the wind like a signal flare. And the most unsettling part from Saladin's perspective is not just that they're coming, it's that they're coming without hesitation. A smaller force that attacks a larger one can feel like madness, and madness has its own psychological power, because it makes experienced soldiers ask a question they don't want to ask. What do they know that we don't? Some Ayyubid troops react late, still mounting, still tightening straps, still pulling helmets into place. Others try to form ranks quickly, but the ground isn't perfectly flat. Shallow folds and depressions break the field into uneven slices. Lines form imperfectly. Gaps remain. Standard bearers fight wind and dust to keep banners upright. The larger force is trying to become an army again, trying to find its rhythm, right as the Crusaders are taking that rhythm away. And on Saladin's rise, the guard tightens around him. Messengers sprint and ride. Orders fly outward, but the battlefield has started to run on something faster than orders: momentum. Now, in modern terms, this is a tempo problem. Saladin's decision cycle, the time it takes to observe, decide, and act, is being outpaced, not because he's slow, but because his army is mid-transition and Baldwin is denying him the minutes needed to finish that transition. You can be the better strategist and still lose the moment if you are caught in the wrong posture. As the Crusaders close the distance, you can almost feel the field contract. Horses move from trot to gallop, stride lengthening, hooves biting into the ground, dust erupting under weight. Lances are held steady, not as wild weapons, but as a coordinated extension of speed and mass. The whole formation becomes a single directed force. Meanwhile, the Ayyubid center is still imperfect. Units are arriving from multiple directions. Some are still threading their way through congestion. Officers are trying to plug gaps while their men are still looking over shoulders, still trying to understand whether this is truly happening. Saladin signals again. Reinforce the center. Brace. Form a line. Hold. His composure doesn't vanish, but there's no hiding the reality. He has been surprised by an opponent he assumed would not risk open battle. And that assumption is the true error. Not arrogance, exactly. Pattern recognition pushed too far. A reasonable belief that hardened into certainty. The Crusaders are now close enough that individual faces can be seen through dust. Eyes looked forward, posture compact under armor weight, hands steady on reins.
Baldwin rides among them, visible, not because he must, but because he understands what visibility does to morale. A king in the line turns fear into focus. In the final seconds before contact, both sides brace. Horses shorten stride slightly, bodies preparing to absorb shock. Riders shift their center of mass forward, then stabilize. It's all physics and discipline, weight and momentum in control. Then the collision begins. Not with theatrical chaos, not with impossible stunts, but with the brutal reality of two formations meeting at speed. Dust explodes upward, swallowing details. Lances splinter and bend under stress. Horses push shoulder to shoulder. Lines compress. Space disappears. This is the moment where a larger army expects its numbers to matter, but numbers don't matter if they can't be brought to bear in the same place at the same time. In the tight crush around the impact point, congestion becomes the enemy of the bigger force. Units pile inward, command becomes harder, movement becomes constrained. And Baldwin's smaller force, because it is compact and committed, continues pressing forward into the place where the larger force is least coherent. Saladin watches through the dust, from his rise. He leans slightly forward, reading the pressure point like a surgeon reading a wound. He sends messengers again. He pulls his guard closer. He tries to create a stable center line before the breach widens. But the breach is already doing its most dangerous work, not only in the ground gained, but in the minds of the soldiers watching it happen. Because once gaps appear in a line, doubt enters like air into a crack, and doubt spreads faster than any messenger. The Crusader infantry becomes visible behind the cavalry, spears and shields forming an orderly wall in the dust. To the Ayuba troops, that can look like more forces arriving. It fears the fear of encirclement, even if the reality is simply a smaller army revealing its full shape. On the Crusader side, the relic remains steady behind them, carried forward through haze like a fixed point in a shifting world. For their soldiers, it says, stay together, keep moving, don't break. For Saladin's men, the sight of a compact enemy advancing with banners and relic can feel like a force larger than it truly is, because morale changes perception. In battle, perception can be decisive. This is the last calm moment Saladin will have in this phase of the fight. He is still trying to stabilize, still trying to reassert order. But Montgisard is not going to be decided by who is smarter on paper. It's going to be decided by who owns the minute in front of them. And Baldwin, the king with the shorter clock, has chosen to spend everything for that minute.
There's a moment in every battle when the world stops feeling like a plan and starts feeling like weather. At Montgisard, that moment came just before the collision, when Baldwin's banners crested the ridge, dust swirled in the low light, and the enemy below was still trying to become a single coherent line. For one heartbeat, everything was held in tension. The Crusaders were compact, disciplined, and painfully tired. Their horses were tense under them, breathing hard, shifting weight as if they could feel what was coming. The infantry behind them tightened grips and closed gaps. The clergy studied the relic the kingdom believed was part of the true cross, holding it upright like an anchor in a moving world. And Baldwin, 16 years old, ill and doubted, sat among the front ranks like a living signal. He didn't need a speech now. He needed synchronization. He looked across the field one last time, then raised his hand. Not dramatically, not like a storybook king, but with the controlled stillness of someone who understands that the next motion will pull the whole army forward. Then his hand dropped, and the line moved as one. At first, it was a measured roll downhill, horses stepping into motion carefully, riders steadying their balance. And then it became faster. Hooves struck the ground with a rhythm you could feel in your chest. Dust exploded under weight. The wedge tightened. Lances angled forward in near unison, their tips catching sunlight through the haze. This is where the physics of medieval warfare becomes impossible to ignore. A cavalry charge isn't just bravery, it's mass and momentum. It's a coordinated system of men, armor, horses, training, and timing. If it stays coherent long enough, it hits like a moving wall. And Baldwin's force stayed coherent. Across the plain, Saladin's men reacted, some quickly, some too late. Riders tightened strops, grabbed helmets, mounted in a hurry. Officers waved arms and shouted silent orders, pulling scattered groups inward. Banners shifted and tried to align. Standards bobbed in the dust as men attempted to form a stable center. Saladin was not passive. From his rise, he watched the ridge and immediately began issuing orders to concentrate. Messengers rode out, the guard tightened around him. He tried to restore the rhythm of command. But a large army takes time to become a single instrument. Distance is friction, dust is confusion, terrain interrupts line of sight. And when you're spread out, even the best system is slow compared to an enemy already committed. The Crusaders were denying him time. As they closed, the battlefield began to shrink. The space where numbers mattered, where a larger army could envelop, flank, and grind down a smaller one, was disappearing behind dust and congestion. Instead, everything narrowed toward a single pressure point, the forming center that hadn't yet fully formed. The final seconds before contact are not graceful, they're tense and technical. Horses shorten stride slightly as they brace. Riders shift their weight forward, then stabilize to absorb impact. Arms lock. Lances hold steady at the exact angle where control meets force. On the Muslim side, the front rank tried to brace unevenly, shields lifted, spear points angled, horses stepping and sidestepping nervously.
Some archers attempted to draw and fire from horseback, but even that is harder than it looks. A bow draw requires stability. A moving horse rarely gives you that stability, and now the ground itself was trembling under the oncoming charge. Then the collision began. Dust surged upward like a curtain being ripped open, swallowing detail. The first contact wasn't a clean line of impact. It was a crush of bodies and animals where space vanished instantly. Landshafts splintered under stress. Horses collided shoulder to shoulder, pushing and pivoting, hooves turning the earth. Riders absorbed shock, recoiled, then pushed again. No floating bodies, no impossible flips, just the brutal mechanics of two formations meeting at speed. And here's the paradox of the heart of Montgisard. The larger army could not fully use its size because the fight was happening in a compressed knot where congestion stole space and time. Units arriving from different directions jammed into each other. Officers tried to guide formations into place, but the pressure point was already choking the battlefield. In modern terms, this is what happens when a system is forced to reconfigure under attack. It's not about courage alone, it's about command and control collapsing faster than it can be repaired. Inside the dust-choked center, the Templars kept pressing forward. Not because they were fearless, but because their discipline was built for exactly this kind of moment. Keep moving, don't scatter, don't pause. When lances broke, riders transitioned to sidearms in compact motions, shields pressed, lines held. Every meter gained increased the enemy's confusion, because it widened the breach and disrupted the attempt to form a stable center. Behind them, the rest of the Crusader Knights followed, adding weight to the push. The infantry began to arrive near the rear of the cavalry action, not rushing wildly but advancing in measured steps, forming a visible support wall that made the Crusader force appear larger through dust and banners. That visibility mattered. To Saladin's men who were already struggling to interpret the battlefield, the sudden clarity of Crusader infantry and standards could feel like reinforcements arriving. It fed the fear of being surrounded, even if on the map they still had space. Fear doesn't need accurate maps, it only needs uncertainty. Through the haze, Baldwin remained visible among his men. He wasn't swinging wildly, he wasn't performing heroics for the sake of legend. He did something more important. He kept the army's attention pointed forward. He made short, controlled gestures, signals to continue, to hold cohesion, to press the advantage before Saladin could stabilize. His posture stayed steady. His horse stepped over uneven churned ground, correcting footing with the careful intelligence animals have when they sense danger. Baldwin adjusted his balance with small movements, conserving control rather than wasting it on drama. Meanwhile, on Saladin's rise, the guard tightened, standards clustered, messengers came and went. Saladin leaned forward, eyes fixed on the breach like a man watching a crack spread through stone. He issued orders to reinforce the center. He tried to guide units into alignment. He created corridors for messengers so communication wouldn't completely choke. This is not the scene of a commander losing his nerve. It's the scene of a commander fighting the physics of disorder. Because once an army begins to lose coherence, every corruption takes longer, and every delay costs more. A messenger is slowed by congestion. A unit arriving to reinforce arrives at the wrong angle. A standard bearer struggles to keep the banner visible in wind and dust. Soldiers glance backward for cues, and that single glance, multiplied across hundreds of riders, can become a wave of doubt. And in the center, the breach continues to widen. Not into a total collapse yet, not in part 6, but into something more dangerous. A bending line, a wavering standard, units yielding ground by small steps, horses stepping backward and sideways as riders try to hold. It's the kind of moment that decides whether a battle stays a battle, or turns into a flight. And Baldwin boasts that if he gives Saladin time to restore a clean line, the weight of numbers will crush his smaller force. So the Crusaders keep pressing, they keep moving, they keep denying the larger army the space it needs to become itself. Through dust and sunset light, the relic remains visible behind them, steady in the hands of the clergy and guarded by disciplined infantry. It doesn't swing like a magical talisman, it simply stays upright, a fixed point in chaos. And that steadiness is its power. Because at Montgisard, the decisive weapon wasn't a secret trick, it was tempo made visible. A small army moving like one body striking a larger army while it was still trying to remember how to be.
A battle doesn't truly turn when the first line is struck. It turns when the larger army starts to doubt that it can control what happens next. At Montgisard, that moment arrived quietly, almost invisibly, inside the dust and noise. The Muslim center didn't suddenly vanish. It didn't explode into chaos all at once. It did something far more dangerous for any commander. It began to bend. Just a few steps at first. A banner wavering. A line yielding a few meters, not because everyone was defeated, but because the pressure in the breach was too focused, too concentrated, and too fast to absorb cleanly. From the Crusader side, the push never stopped. Knights kept their spacing. The Templars, disciplined and compact, continued pressing into the imperfect centerline. When lances broke, they adopted without losing cohesion. Behind them, the rest of the cavalry stayed tight enough to keep the motion forward, less like a wave and more like a wedge that refused to slow down. And in the dust, Baldwin remained visible. This matters more than people think. A king in a medieval battle is not just a commander, he's a signal system. He's something soldiers can see when the world becomes confusion. His presence says the plan still exists. Baldwin didn't need to perform heroics. He needed to keep the line moving. He made short, controlled gestures, forward, hold, keep together. He stayed steady in the saddle. He kept his posture calm enough that the men around him could borrow that calm. Across the field, the larger army began to show its first real weakness, hesitation. It started in the rear ranks and the wings, where information comes late and rumors arrive early. Riders turned their heads again and again, trying to read the battlefield through dust.
They looked for the green standards, for officers, for the familiar shape of an organized line. But the line was no longer a single shape. It was becoming a collection of shapes. And every time a soldier sees gaps where there should be certainty, the mind does something dangerous. It begins to fill the gaps with fear. On Saladin's rise, the situation was turning into a command crisis. Not because Saladin lost composure, he didn't, but because command is only as strong as the system beneath it. Saladin signaled to stabilize. He dispatched messengers. He tried to pull units inward and form a clean line behind the breach. His guard tightened around him. Standards clustered close. Corridors were cleared for messengers. Every movement was disciplined and deliberate. But you can't fix an army's cohesion instantly, especially when the battlefield is already running on momentum instead of orders. And then Baldwin's second pressure point arrived. Through the dust, Crusader infantry became more visible. Not because they suddenly appeared from nowhere, but because the battle's movement in the shifting haze revealed them. Spears and shields formed a steady support line behind the cavalry. The relic remained upright among them, stable, guarded, and moving with measured discipline. To the Crusaders, this meant reinforcement in structure. To Saladin's men, it could look like something worse, an expanding enemy. Even if on a map the Crusaders were still outnumbered, perception doesn't care about a map. Soldiers who can't see the whole field begin to imagine it. They imagine hidden forces, they imagine encirclement, they imagine doom arriving from the flanks. And that imagined threat can be more powerful than the real one. This is how morale breaks in real time. It's rarely dramatic at first. It's subtle. It's contagious. One unit edges backward a few steps. Another sees it and assumes the worst. A third unit starts to withdraw faster, thinking it's avoiding being cut off. Soon what began as cautious repositioning becomes a drift, and drift becomes a stream. Saladin's officers tried to stop it. They pointed, they shouted silent orders. They rode into gaps to pull men into place. Some units obeyed. Others were already moving too fast to hear or too confused to interpret what they heard correctly. And the terrain made everything worse. The Montgisard plain is not perfectly open and flat. It has shallow folds and low gullies, small depressions that can channel movement. In a controlled maneuver, those features are manageable. In a retreat, they become bottlenecks. As the Muslim wings began to peel away, riders naturally steered toward the same low paths, the same easier routes, the same shallow crossings. Dust pooled in those depressions, reducing visibility. Congestion increased. Horses slowed and bumped lightly, forced into tighter space. This is where the collapse begins to accelerate, because once a retreating force compresses into narrow terrain, its mobility, the very thing cavalry depends on, is stolen. And once mobility is stolen, fear becomes heavier. The Crusaders saw the movement and did what you must do when you're the smaller force: exploit before the window closes. A commander signaled pursuit, not in a reckless scatter, but in a controlled acceleration. Knights angled their line toward the streams of retreat, keeping cohesion enough to remain effective. Horses surged forward, stride lengthening, tack creaking, dust erupting under hose. Baldwin stayed near the decision points, scanning through thinning haze and directing movement with calm gestures. From a modern perspective, this is the most impressive part of his command. He didn't simply ride with rage or adrenaline. He assessed, he chose directions, he aimed his force where it would create the maximum psychological pressure. Meanwhile, Saladin was fighting a different battle, the battle to preserve his command element. As gaps widened and retreat streams multiplied, Saladin's guard tightened further. Standards moved with him. The protective ring shifted along the rise to keep his position from being swallowed by the disorder below. He began repositioning, not as a dramatic flight, but as a controlled withdrawal to prevent capture and preserve future capability. This is the moment where optics start to matter as much as tactics. Soldiers look for their leader's banner. They look for their commander's position. If that position shifts, even for sound reasons, men who are already uncertain may interpret it as collapse. A ripple runs backward through the ranks. The command is moving. And for exhausted men in dust and confusion, that can translate instantly into, we are losing. Even if Saladin is executing the correct choice, preserve the core, regroup, rebuild, the field doesn't always interpret correct choices correctly. In battle, perception spreads faster than truth. So more groups accelerate away, more gaps open, more standards tilt and drift. The larger formation breaks into separate moving streams. It is not yet the final annihilation that later storytellers exaggerate, but the essential transformation has happened. The Muslim army has stopped behaving like one army. It is now behaving like many groups trying to survive the next 10 minutes. And in that state, the advantage of numbers fades. Thousands of men are meaningless if they cannot act together. On the Crusader side, the core remains controlled. Infantry holds around the relic. The cavalry continues forward in pursuit, but the center of the force does not dissolve into chaos. That discipline, maintaining an ordered core even while exploiting momentum, is what prevents the smaller army from being suddenly counterattacked by a regrouping enemy. In other words, Baldwin's side is still operating as a system. Saladin's side is increasingly operating as fragments. As the sun lowers further, the dust begins to thin in patches, and the field resolves into a grim clarity. The battle has crossed a threshold. It's no longer about who can win the line. It's about whether the larger army can ever regain control before it dissolves completely. And for Saladin, the decision ahead becomes brutal and simple. Not how to win today, how to survive today so he can return another year. Because that is the difference between a commander who thinks in moments and a commander who thinks in campaigns. Baldwin is spending everything on the moment. Saladin is trying to preserve what remains of the campaign. And the land itself, the gullies, the folds, the bottlenecks, has begun to choose sides, turning movement into congestion and congestion into panic. By the end of part 7, the most important thing has already happened. The larger army has started to run on fear. And fear, once it gains momentum, is almost impossible to stop.
Sunset didn't end the battle so much as it revealed what the battle had become. As the light dropped over the Montgisard plain, the dust that had hidden everything all afternoon began to thin in patches. In the distance, scattered riders disappeared into the low ground, turning into smaller and smaller silhouettes, separate streams instead of a single army. The sound of hooves faded in waves, like a storm moving away. Closer to the center, the Crusader banners still stood, the Jerusalem cross, the black and white standard of the Templars, and near them, held steady amid wind and haze, the relic the kingdom believed was part of the true cross. That steadiness mattered. It told Baldwin's men something simple and powerful. The fight was over, and order still existed. Across the field, Saladin made the choice that every commander eventually faces when a day turns against him. Preserve the core, preserve the future. His guard tightened around him on the rise, green standards close, spacing disciplined even as the larger force around them unraveled. In the confusion and dust, the safest way to move quickly across rough ground wasn't always a warhorse. The sources describe Saladin escaping with a swift mount, and later retellings often emphasize a camel. Whether horse or camel in that exact moment, the meaning is the same. He withdrew fast enough to survive. And survival for a commander with an empire behind him is not cowardice, it's continuity. But in battle, symbols travel faster than explanations. Men in the rear, already confused, already breathing dust, already hearing rumors, saw the standards shift and interpreted it in the worst possible way. The retreat accelerated. Groups broke into streams, streams broke into individuals. Terrain and low gullies turned movement into congestion, and congestion turned caution into panic. Saladin's guard did what disciplined guards are meant to do. They screened the withdrawal. They held formation. They created space. They moved like a living shield, protecting the command element from being swallowed by the collapse behind it. It was a professional retreat inside a collapsing system. Meanwhile, Baldwin's side did something that kept their victory from turning into a reckless gamble. They consolidated. The Crusader infantry held around the relic. They didn't scatter across the field in wild pursuit. They formed an ordered core, spears and shields steady, banners visible, spacing controlled. That meant Baldwin's army remained an army even as the enemy stopped behaving like one. It's not glamorous, but it's what wins wars, discipline after momentum. In the fading light, Crusader cavalry slowed and regrouped near the core. Horses heaved and sweated, tack creaked, riders checked on one another with brief gestures. Some turned their heads toward the horizon, expecting a sudden reversal. But the horizon stayed empty except for dust and distance. And then, in the middle of that hard-earned quiet, Baldwin finally allowed himself to stop moving. Not in triumph, in exhaustion. Attendants helped him down near the relic, careful and practical. No dramatic collapse, no theater, just a young king whose body had been pushed beyond what it was built to handle. In torchlight, dust still clinging to his cheeks, he listened to brief reports. He nodded. He gave small instructions. He kept doing the one thing he'd done all day, turning chaos into order. Then came the other side of victory, what the chroniclers talk about less, but what every army understands immediately. The field was full of abandoned supplies. Tents, pack animals, spare horses, bundles and chests left behind by a retreat that became too fast to carry everything. Under torchlight, Crusader squires moved carefully through the scattered camp area, opening lids, checking ropes, guiding loose animals. Not with greed, but with purpose. Captured resources weren't treasure in the romantic sense. They were survival. Food, equipment, coin, tack, tools. The difference between a kingdom that can pay soldiers and a kingdom that cannot. In one afternoon, Baldwin hadn't just broken a campaign. He had bought his kingdom time and material breathing room. In the improvised field hospital near the relic, the reality of the day settled on everyone's shoulders. Attendants washed hands in ceramic bowls. Linen strips were cut. Helmets were removed slowly. Men sat in silence with the heavy, stunned calm that comes after danger passes. As night deepened, campfires dotted the plain, small orange islands against a dark sky. Sentries cased measured routes. Horses were tethered. The relic stood near the center like a fixed point around which the kingdom could reassemble itself. And somewhere beyond the darkness, Saladin's reduced escort moved through the scrub under moonlight. The retreat was disciplined, but it was not easy. Guards traded positions to keep the screen intact.
Water skins were checked. The pace stayed steady. Saladin rode forward with controlled breathing. And at least once, if you picture him as a human being rather than a monument, you can imagine him looking back toward the distant glow of fires. Not with melodrama. With calculation. And with the quiet awareness that a campaign he expected to dominate had just been humbled. By dawn, Saladin's column approached the safety of his own world. The outlines of city walls and minarets rose out of haze. The gates opened. He entered quietly. No parade. No proclamation. Just the heavy return of a leader who understands that reputation is part of power. And that reputation had taken a blow. Inside the citadel courtyard, he dismounted with assistants. Servants took reins. Officials waited in a silence that said everything. When Saladin entered his hall, he raised a hand to calm reactions. That gesture, small, controlled, was leadership in its most essential form. Preventing fear from spreading inside your own house. Then he went to the map. Because commanders who survive don't live in yesterday. They rebuild tomorrow. In lamplight, Saladin moved tokens back from Crusader territory to safer lines. He did not pretend the day hadn't happened. He treated it as data. As a lesson. As an injury that could be healed through discipline and time. Back in the Crusader camp, Baldwin's men were doing the same thing in their own language. Clerks tallied supplies. Captured horses were organized. Equipment was sorted and repaired. A portable anvil rang with measured strikes as armorers straightened bent fittings. Patrols rode slow arcs around the field, watching the horizon for any sign of regrouping. This is the part of medieval warfare that feels surprisingly modern. Logistics, accounting, consolidation, and risk management. Baldwin sat near the relic in the gentle morning light, listening to reports. His bandaged hands rested on his knees. His fingers flexed once, slow and controlled, as if testing whether the body still belonged to him. Then he gave another small order. Send a messenger. Because a victory isn't real until your capital believes it. That rider went hard toward Jerusalem, a small cross pennant fluttering behind him. When watchmen on the walls finally spot the messenger, the city's posture changed. Gates began to move. Guards leaned forward. The message reached stone corridors and candlelit chambers. And then Jerusalem reacted the way a threatened city reacts when it realizes it has survived. People gathered in streets. Some embraced. Some knelt. Bells rang. Clergy lifted hands in prayer under Romanesque arches and candle smoke. But even in celebration, the truth remained. Baldwin's victory did not end the war. It postponed it. It bought time in a conflict where time was everything. For Baldwin, that time was personal. His illness would continue its slow work. The kingdom's politics would continue their constant arguments. His enemies would recover. For Saladin, the time was strategic. He would rebuild. He would tighten discipline. He would return with a force shaped by this humiliation. More cautious. More coherent. Less willing to assume the enemy would behave predictably. So Part 8 ends with a strange kind of silence. On one horizon, the Crusader banners move away under sunrise. Orderly, exhausted, but alive. On the other horizon, Saladin's world regroups behind its walls. Wounded in reputation, but still intact. And in between them is the same dust. The same land. The same truth that Montgisard proved for one unforgettable day. Wars are not decided only by size. They are decided by posture, tempo, perception, and a rare leader who knows exactly when to strike.
Montgisard didn't destroy Saladin. It didn't end the war. What it did, quietly, decisively, was buy the Crusader kingdom something it almost never had: breathing room. In the mornings after the battle, the field looked less like a legend and more like work. The Crusaders gathered what had been left behind: horses, tack, supplies, because in medieval warfare, victory isn't only about the moment, it's about what you can carry forward afterward. Clerks counted, squadrons reorganized, patrols watched the horizon. And in that practical, unglamorous rhythm, the kingdom of Jerusalem gained time it desperately needed. Back in Jerusalem, the mood shifted almost overnight. The city had been bracing for disaster, and suddenly it was celebrating survival. Bells rang, churches filled, people spoke Baldwin's name with a kind of disbelief, because even those who doubted him had to admit the truth. A sick teenage king had forced the most feared commander of the age to retreat. But here's the part the victory couldn't fix. The kingdom's deeper problems were still there, waiting, unchanged. The Crusader states were always short on manpower, always divided by politics, always arguing over who should command and who should inherit. Montgisard didn't erase those tensions, it simply pushed the deadline back. And Baldwin's body, his personal clock, kept ticking. In the years that followed, Baldwin remained what he had been at Montgisard: sharp, present, and politically active. He wasn't only a battlefield figure, he was a king who managed alliances, balanced rival noble families, and tried to keep the military orders, the barons, and the crown moving in the same direction. But leprosy does not negotiate. Over time, the symptoms worsened, numbness deepened, wounds became harder to notice and harder to heal. Weakness crept in. Chroniclers describe him growing more limited physically, even as his mind remained steady. And that contrast, an intelligent ruler trapped in a deteriorating body, became the central tragedy of his reign. Modern viewers might recognize what was happening in a different vocabulary. The kingdom was becoming dangerously dependent on one individual. In leadership terms, that's called key man risk. When a system only works because a particular person is present, the system is fragile, even if it looks strong on good days. Jerusalem looked strong because Baldwin made it look strong. And Saladin noticed. Saladin's defeat at Montgisard shook him, but it also taught him. He tightened discipline. He became more cautious about how he deployed his forces. He avoided giving the Crusaders the same kind of window twice. He continued building the deeper strength of his state: money, manpower, alliances, legitimacy. He played the long game because he could. That's the difference that Montgisard highlights so brutally. Baldwin needed time, and Saladin had time. And the years after Montgisard prove it. As the decade moved on, the Crusader kingdom began slipping back into familiar patterns: internal rivalries, succession anxiety, factions forming and hardening. The barons argued in halls lit by torches and pride. Courtiers whispered in corridors. Treaties were drafted and redrafted. People watched Baldwin's health like they were watching the weather, because everyone understood what his decline would mean. At the same time, Saladin's world was consolidating. In Cairo and Damascus, councils met with a different mood, not panic, but recalibration. The defeat became a lesson embedded in strategy. The unity Saladin had forged didn't vanish because of one setback. It bent, then tightened again. And then the most important shift happened. Baldwin's ability to personally lead, his greatest advantage, began to fade. The more limited he became physically, the more the kingdom reverted to committees, rival commanders, and contested authority. That didn't automatically doom them, but it made them predictable, and predictability is a gift to a strategist like Saladin. When Baldwin died in 1185, only 24 years old, Jerusalem didn't just lose a king, it lost the central nerve of its system. His death is often described with a kind of quiet horror in the sources: candles, clergy, a chamber full of people who know they're watching more than one life end. Because once Baldwin was gone, the question wasn't who will rule, it was who can hold the kingdom together the way he did. And 2 years later, the answer became painfully clear. In 1187, the Crusader army suffered a catastrophic defeat at Hattin. You don't need graphic detail to understand how crushing it was. The army was drawn into a situation where heat, thirst, exhaustion, and miscalculation combined into a disaster. It wasn't simply that Saladin had more men. It was that the Crusaders made choices that stripped them of their advantages, choices that a healthier, commanding Baldwin might have prevented, or might not have. History doesn't give us a clean alternate timeline, but it does give us a pattern. When Baldwin was present, Jerusalem could still surprise and still hold cohesion under pressure. Without him, the kingdom's fractures mattered more, and its decisions grew worse at the moments they needed to be best. After Hattin, Jerusalem was exposed. Saladin moved on the city, and this time there was no Montgisard-style window to exploit. There was no sudden moment where the larger force was caught scattered and vulnerable. Saladin had learned too much, and the Crusaders had lost too much. The city eventually surrendered. And that's where the story becomes more complex than the simplistic good versus evil versions that get repeated. Saladin's capture of Jerusalem is remembered not only for conquest, but also for restraint, compared to the slaughter that had marked earlier captures in the region. He negotiated ransoms, he allowed many civilians to leave. He sought legitimacy through measured rule, not only through the sword. That doesn't make medieval warfare gentle, it wasn't, but it does show Saladin as what he always was, a commander who understood that politics and optics are part of victory. So when you look back at Montgisard from this point, knowing Jerusalem will fall a decade later, Baldwin's victory becomes even more striking. It wasn't a turning point that reversed history permanently. It was a reprieve, a single afternoon that bought years. And that raises the modern lesson that sits under the whole story. Montgisard wasn't primarily about numbers. Medieval chroniclers loved numbers, and leader storytellers loved them even more. But the real driver of the outcome was posture and tempo. Baldwin said when Saladin's army was dispersed and transitioning, he moved faster than Saladin could reconfigure. He made the battlefield smaller, tighter, and more confusing for the larger force. He turned an advantage of size into a disadvantage of friction. That's modern warfare language, but it fits. It also wasn't simply faith beats force. Faith mattered, absolutely, because morale matters. The relic mattered if his symbols matter. But if faith alone won battles, every devoted army would always win, and history clearly shows that they don't. What Baldwin combined, rarely, brilliantly, was belief, timing, and decisive commitment. And the tragedy is that his kingdom couldn't institutionalize what he personally embodied. Montgisard proves what can happen when a leader understands tempo. The decade that follows proves what happens when a state cannot survive the loss of its leader. So if you step back far enough to see both men clearly, the ending feels almost inevitable. Baldwin wins the most unlikely day of his life and spends the next years paying for it with a body that keeps failing. Saladin loses his most humiliating day and spends the next years turning that humiliation into discipline, learning, and long-term advantage.
2 men, 2 clocks, one afternoon where the desert seemed to blink, and when it opened its eyes again, history was still moving, just with 10 extra years that only Baldwin's courage and timing had purchased.
Years after Montgisard, the battlefield itself went quiet again. If you stand on that Levantine plain in the early morning, with thin mist hugging the ground and wind pushing dust in lazy sheets, you can almost believe nothing important ever happened there. The grass bends, the light shifts, a distant ruin on a low ridge throws a long shadow, and the world feels too ordinary for the kind of story we tell about it. And yet, this is where a kingdom bought time. This is where 2 men, living by 2 different clocks, collided. What we call history often begins as handwriting in a dim room. In a Crusader monastery, a monk leans over parchment, candlelight trembling on stone walls. He writes slowly, carefully, recording what his world cannot afford to forget. Across the sea and desert, in Cairo, another scribe writes his own version, under lamps beneath carved arches, with the calm precision of a state that expects to endure. 2 sets of hands, 2 languages, the same event. Because Montgisard wasn't just a battle, it was a shock to the stories both sides were telling themselves. For Baldwin IV, the story was survival. Back in Jerusalem, the king's world was never as romantic as later legends make it sound. It was stone halls and hard councils. It was rival banners hanging in the same room. It was advisors who argued too loudly, and nobles who agreed too quietly. It was a teenage king with an illness that didn't care about politics. When Baldwin sat at a table with reports and seals and letters, his authority didn't come from theatrics. It came from the simple fact that he kept making decisions when people expected him to disappear. Sometimes the camera of history lingers on details that feel small but carry everything. Baldwin's hands wrapped in linen, fingers flexing carefully around a quill, a wax seal pressed with steady pressure, a letter set down with deliberate control, a breath held, then released. That's not spectacle, that's leadership under constraint. For Saladin, the story was restoration. After Montgisard, his war didn't end, it matured. He returned to his councils and his maps and his disciplined routines. He rebuilt what he could rebuild: cohesion, caution, patience. He learned to respect the dangerous part of a smaller enemy, not their numbers, but their ability to strike at the wrong time. When Saladin placed a hand on a map or moved a token along a route, it wasn't just strategy. It was a reminder that he could afford to think in seasons, in years, in campaigns measured by time and resources. That's the difference between them. Saladin had the long clock, Baldwin didn't. And if Montgisard teaches anything with brutal clarity, it's that time is a weapon, sometimes the greatest weapon of all. The Crusader kingdom used the years after Montgisard to repair walls, reinforce gates, drill troops, and stabilize finances with captured supplies. Fortresses were patched, training yards filled, messengers carried orders along dusty roads. For a while, the kingdom looked stronger than it had any right to look. But the deeper weakness was still there. The kingdom of Jerusalem was always fragile because it wasn't a single solid machine. It was a web: barons, military orders, rival claimants, marriages, inheritance, and constant negotiation. And Baldwin, more than anyone else, was the thread holding that web together. Modern leadership studies would call this single point of failure. A system that depends too heavily on one person can perform brilliantly until that person is gone. Baldwin's illness made that risk unavoidable. So while chroniclers might describe Montgisard like a miracle, the more unsettling truth is this: the victory may have made the kingdom even more dependent on Baldwin's presence. It proved what he could do, and it quietly proved what would happen when he could no longer do it. As years passed, Baldwin's physical strength declined. The sources describe the slow tightening of limits: less sensation, more vulnerability, more fatigue. You can imagine him in a small chapel, kneeling with difficulty, rising with help, refusing to let his body dictate his mind. You can imagine him holding his hand near a candle flame and feeling less than he should, an ordinary moment that becomes terrifying when you understand what it implies. And still, he governed. Still, he tried to hold the kingdom together. Saladin, meanwhile, continued to grow into the role history remembers him for, not just as a battlefield commander, but as a builder of authority. His councils reconvened, his banners rose again, his soldiers drilled again. He took the humiliation of Montgisard and turned it into discipline. That's how strong systems respond to setbacks. They adapt. Eventually, the larger tide returned. After Baldwin's death in 1185, only 24 years old, Jerusalem lost more than a king. It lost a kind of clarity. And in war, clarity is the difference between survival and self-destruction.
2 years later, at Hattin, the Crusader army was drawn into a situation where its weaknesses were exposed. First, heat, exhaustion, fractured leadership, and choices made under pressure that stripped away their advantages. It wasn't simply a matter of more men win. It was the compound effect of bad conditions and worse decisions, made by a system that no longer had Baldwin's steady hand. And then in 1187, Jerusalem fell to Saladin. That outcome is often told with the tone of destiny, but destiny is usually just the name we give to patterns we fail to change. Saladin arrived with a force shaped by years of rebuilding. Jerusalem faced him without the same unity, without the same leadership, and without the same ability to create an unexpected window. Still, it matters to say this clearly. Saladin's capture of Jerusalem is remembered not only for conquest, but also for restraint compared to earlier atrocities in the region. The medieval world was not gentle, but Saladin understood governance. He understood legitimacy. He understood that victory isn't complete if it creates endless cycles of vengeance. So the story of these two men doesn't end with a simple moral label, it ends with consequence. And that brings us back to Montgisard, back to what it actually means. If you strip away the inflated numbers, the dramatic masks, and the clean good versus evil framing, you're left with something that modern people can recognize immediately. Baldwin won because he attacked an army that was dispersed and in transition. He won because he understood tempo, because he moved before Saladin could reconfigure, before orders could travel, before scattered units could become a single line. He made the battlefield small enough that the larger force couldn't use its size effectively. He also understood morale, not as a mystical force, but as a practical system. The relic mattered because it gave his army a visible anchor. The banners mattered because they gave frightened men a focal point. Baldwin's presence mattered because a leader in the line is a signal that the plan still exists. If you want a modern way to put it, Montgisard is a lesson in systems under stress. A larger system, stretched and confident, can fail suddenly when it is hit at the wrong moment. A smaller system, compressed and unified, can create shock that breaks the larger system's ability to coordinate. That's not medieval magic. That's human behavior under pressure. And yet, there is still room for the mythic feeling people describe. Because to the men who lived through that day, it must have felt supernatural, not because the laws of nature were suspended, but because the laws of expectation were. When an army expects you to hide, and you charge. When a leader expects you to delay, and you commit. When the world expects the sick boy to step aside, and he rides forward anyway. That doesn't break physics, it breaks prediction. And in war, breaking prediction can be as powerful as breaking steel. So when we talk about Baldwin IV and Saladin, it's worth holding both truths at once. Baldwin's courage bought time, but time still ran out. His victory could not permanently solve the demographic and political realities crushing the Crusader states. It could only delay them. Saladin's defeat humiliated him, but it did not destroy him, because his power wasn't built on one afternoon. It was built on structure, and structure is how you come back. In the end, Montgisard becomes something rare, a moment that shines even brighter because it did not last forever, a moment when a fragile kingdom stood upright, a moment when a commander with an empire behind him learned caution, a moment when the desert seemed to blink, and in that blink, history shifted just enough to grant a decade that shouldn't have existed. And if you take one last look at the horizon, Jerusalem's walls in the distance, the desert road fading towards Cairo, you can feel the final lesson settle in, quietly and without mercy. Courage can buy time, but time always returns to collect what it is owed.